The smoke still hung thick in the air. Somewhere behind the crumbling stone walls of a Normandy village, a German patrol moved cautiously through the morning mist. They checked their rifles, scanned the tree line, spoke in low whispers. They had no idea what was coming. From 30 yards away, hidden in the shadow of an ancient tower, a British officer drew back his bowstring. Not a rifle, not a sidearm, a longbow. The same weapon English archers had used at Agincourt 500 years earlier. His fingers released. The arrow flew true. It struck the lead German officer squarely in the chest. Before the rest of the patrol could even comprehend what had happened, a man emerged from cover, swinging a Scottish broadsword, bellowing commands to his infantrymen. The ambush had begun, and in that moment a legend was born. This was not a scene from medieval history. This was May 1940. The Second World War was raging across Europe. Tanks rolled through Poland. Bombers screamed over London. Machine guns rattled through the forests of France. And yet, here stood a British Army officer, armed with weapons from another century, fighting the most technologically advanced military force the world had ever seen. His name was John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. But the men who served under him, and the enemies who faced him, knew him by another name, Mad Jack. Some thought he was insane. Others believed he was simply fearless. A few suspected he was both. But what no one could deny was this: the man with the longbow, the bagpipes, and the medieval sword would become one of the most decorated soldiers of the entire war. His exploits would span 4 continents. He would lead daring commando raids in Norway. He would capture dozens of German soldiers armed with nothing but his blade. He would survive capture, imprisonment in a Nazi concentration camp, and 2 separate escapes. And through it all, he never stopped believing in one simple creed: any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. This is the story of Mad Jack Churchill, the soldier the world laughed at, until he became the stuff of legend. If you find these stories from history as fascinating as we do, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the most incredible tales of human courage. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Jack Churchill was born on the 16th of September, 1906, in Colombo, Ceylon, which is modern-day Sri Lanka. His father, Alec Fleming Churchill, was a civil engineer serving in the British colonial administration. The family had deep roots in Oxfordshire, England, but young Jack's earliest years were spent far from the green hills of home. When he was 4 years old, his father was appointed Director of Public Works in Hong Kong, and the family relocated to the bustling British colony on the South China coast. It was here, amid the humid streets and colonial architecture of Hong Kong, that Jack first developed the restless spirit that would define his life. He had 2 brothers, Thomas, who would later become a commando leader himself, and Robert, known as Buster, who would serve in the Royal Navy and tragically lose his life in 1942. The 3 Churchill brothers grew up immersed in tales of empire, adventure, and military glory. But it was Jack who seemed to take those stories most to heart. In 1917, the family returned to England. Jack was sent to King William's College on the Isle of Man, a prestigious boarding school known for its rigorous academic and athletic traditions. It was here that young Churchill discovered his love for history, particularly the medieval period. He devoured books about knights, crusaders, and the legendary battles of old. He studied the longbow, that quintessentially English weapon that had once decided the fate of nations, and he began to develop a philosophy that would guide him for the rest of his life: courage, honor, and a certain flair for the dramatic. After completing his education, Churchill enrolled at the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, the training ground for Britain's future officers. He graduated in 1926 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment. His first posting took him to Burma, where the British Empire maintained a significant military presence. Burma was a world away from the manicured lawns of England. The jungles were thick and unforgiving. The heat was oppressive. Bandits prowled the rivers and villages. For a young officer seeking adventure, it was perfect. Churchill threw himself into his duties with characteristic enthusiasm. He participated in flag marches down the Irrawaddy River, the great commercial highway that snaked through the country. He gathered intelligence on suspected criminals. He learned the rhythms of colonial military life. But what truly captured his imagination was the motorcycle. Churchill purchased a Zenith and proceeded to ride it 1,500 miles across the Indian subcontinent, from his signals course in Pune all the way back to Burma. The journey was perilous. At one point he accidentally crashed into a water buffalo. At another he balanced his motorcycle on railroad ties, listening for the distant rumble of approaching trains. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of adventure Churchill craved. It was also in Burma that Churchill discovered another passion that would follow him into battle: the bagpipes. His Scottish heritage had always stirred something deep within him, and he decided to master the instrument. He practiced relentlessly, filling the tropical air with the haunting drones and skirling melodies of Scotland. His fellow officers thought it peculiar. Churchill did not care. He had found his voice. After a decade of military service, Churchill left the army in 1936. The world was changing. War clouds were gathering over Europe. But for the moment, Churchill was drawn to a different kind of adventure. He traveled to Nairobi, Kenya, where he worked as a newspaper editor. His chiseled features and athletic build also caught the attention of the modeling industry, and he took on work as a male model. It was an unusual career path for a former Army officer, but Churchill had never been one to follow convention. His skills as an archer, honed over years of practice, eventually led him to the world of film. In 1940, he appeared in a small role in the classic fantasy movie The Thief of Baghdad, advising on archery techniques and demonstrating his remarkable accuracy. He could hit targets consistently from 200 yards, a feat that impressed even seasoned archers. In 1939, he represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo, Norway, finishing in 26th place. It was a respectable showing, but for Churchill, archery was never about competition. It was about connection to a warrior tradition that stretched back centuries. Then came September 1939. Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war, and Jack Churchill immediately sought to rejoin the army. The gentleman archer, the bagpiper, the adventurer, was about to become a soldier once again. Churchill was assigned to the Manchester Regiment as part of the British Expeditionary Force sent to France. The mood among the troops was cautiously optimistic. The Maginot Line, that vast network of fortifications along the French border, was supposed to hold back the German tide. The war would be over by Christmas, some said. But Churchill knew better. He had studied military history. He understood that wars rarely followed predictable scripts. When he departed for France, he carried the standard equipment of a British infantry officer: his uniform, his sidearm, his helmet. But he also brought items that made his fellow officers raise their eyebrows: a longbow, arrows, and a basket-hilted claymore, a Scottish broadsword with a blade nearly 3 feet long. It was the kind of weapon a Highland warrior might have carried into battle centuries earlier. In 1940, it seemed almost absurdly anachronistic, but Churchill had his reasons. The Battle of France was a disaster for the Allies. The Germans launched their blitzkrieg offensive in May 1940, bypassing the Maginot Line entirely by driving through the Ardennes forest. French and British forces were caught off guard. The retreat began almost immediately. As the British Expeditionary Force fell back toward the coast, Churchill found himself in the thick of the fighting. It was near the village of L'Epinette in late May that Churchill had his first opportunity to prove that medieval weapons still had a place on the modern battlefield. A German patrol was approaching British positions. Churchill spotted them from his concealed position near an old tower. He drew his longbow, nocked an arrow, and waited. When the lead German officer came into view, Churchill released. The arrow struck home. The German fell, and before the rest of the patrol could react, Churchill was charging forward with his sword drawn, leading his men in a savage counterattack. The ambush was successful. The Germans were routed, and word began to spread through the British ranks about the officer with the bow and arrow. Some thought it was a joke at first. Surely no one would actually use a longbow against modern soldiers armed with rifles and machine guns. But the reports were verified. Lieutenant Colonel Churchill had indeed scored one of the last confirmed longbow kills in military history, perhaps the very last by a British soldier. For his actions during the fighting in France, Churchill was awarded the Military Cross, one of Britain's highest decorations for valor. He had also taken a bullet to the shoulder during the Battle of Lepinette, but the wound only seemed to add to his growing legend. Here was an officer who had charged German troops with a sword, killed an enemy with a bow and arrow, and kept fighting even after being shot. The other soldiers did not know quite what to make of him, but they were beginning to understand that Jack Churchill was not like other men. The evacuation from Dunkirk was a harrowing experience for the entire British Expeditionary Force. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers crowded onto the beaches, waiting for rescue, while German aircraft strafed and bombed them. Small boats, fishing vessels, and pleasure craft joined the Royal Navy in ferrying men across the English Channel. It was a defeat dressed up as a miracle. But for Churchill, it was also a turning point. Back in England, Churchill learned of a new type of military unit being formed. They were called commandos, elite soldiers trained for raiding operations behind enemy lines. The missions would be dangerous. The training would be brutal. The casualty rates would be high. Churchill volunteered immediately. The commandos were Winston Churchill's brainchild, though Jack was not related to the Prime Minister, despite sharing his famous surname. The Prime Minister wanted a force that could strike at the German-occupied coastline, keep the enemy off balance, and demonstrate that Britain was still capable of offensive action, even as the threat of invasion loomed. The men selected for commando training were volunteers from across the British Army, handpicked for their physical fitness, mental toughness, and willingness to take risks. Jack Churchill thrived in this environment. The training was conducted in Scotland, in the rugged Highlands, where the weather was often miserable and the terrain unforgiving. The recruits learned hand-to-hand combat, demolitions, amphibious assault techniques, and survival skills. They were pushed to their physical and mental limits. Many washed out. Those who remained emerged as some of the toughest, most capable soldiers in the British military. Churchill served initially with No. 3 Commando, eventually rising to become second in command. His brother Thomas also joined the Commandos, continuing the Churchill family tradition of military service. And Jack never abandoned his signature weapons. He continued to carry his longbow, his Scottish broadsword, and of course his beloved bagpipes. His fellow commandos grew accustomed to the sight, their officer playing haunting Scottish tunes as they prepared for another dangerous mission. The first major test for Churchill and his commandos came on the 27th of December, 1941. The target was Vågsøy, a small island off the coast of Norway that housed a German garrison. The operation was codenamed Archery, and its goal was to destroy fish oil factories and military installations that the Germans were using to support their war effort. It would be one of the most daring commando raids of the entire war. The assault force consisted of several commando units supported by the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. Churchill was in the first landing craft to approach the shore. The plan called for the commandos to land under cover of a naval bombardment and a smoke screen laid down by RAF bombers. As the landing craft closed in on the beach, the tension was almost unbearable. The men checked their weapons one last time. They steadied their nerves, and then the ramp fell. What happened next became one of the defining moments of Jack Churchill's legendary career. As the commandos prepared to charge ashore, Churchill stood at the front of the landing craft, bagpipes in hand. He began to play March of the Cameron Men, a traditional Scottish tune that stirred the blood and steeled the heart. The sound of the pipes cut through the roar of explosions and gunfire. It was surreal, it was inspiring, and it was quintessentially Mad Jack. With the final note still echoing across the water, Churchill drew his claymore and leaped onto the beach. He charged forward into the smoke, sword raised high, bellowing orders to his men. The commandos followed, storming the German positions with ferocious intensity. The element of surprise was complete. Within 10 minutes, the garrison at WWII was overrun. German soldiers were killed or captured by the dozens. The fish oil factories were demolished. The mission was a resounding success. Churchill was wounded during the raid when a demolition charge exploded prematurely nearby. Shrapnel gashed his head. He was holding a bottle of Moselle wine he had liberated from the German commanding officer's quarters when the blast occurred. The bottle shattered. Churchill barely seemed to notice. He simply bandaged his wound and carried on. News of the WWII raid and of the peculiar officer who had led the charge playing bagpipes and swinging a sword spread quickly. Churchill's legend grew. To the men who served under him, he was an inspiration. To the German soldiers who faced him, he was a terrifying enigma. And to the British public, desperate for good news in those dark days, he was a symbol of defiance and courage. We are about halfway through this incredible story, and if you are enjoying this journey through history, consider giving this video a like. It helps us reach more viewers who share a passion for extraordinary tales like this one. Now, let us continue. In July 1943, the war took Churchill to a new theater, the Mediterranean. The Allies were preparing to invade Sicily, the first step in the liberation of Italy from fascist control. Operation Husky, as it was called, would involve massive amphibious landings and some of the fiercest fighting of the entire war. And Jack Churchill, now commanding No. 2 Commando, was right in the middle of it. Churchill landed at Catania on the eastern coast of Sicily, looking every bit the eccentric warrior he had become. His Scottish broadsword hung at his waist. His longbow and arrows were slung around his neck, and his bagpipes were tucked under his arm. The other soldiers had grown accustomed to this sight by now, but it still drew stares from the American and other Allied troops who had not encountered the legendary Mad Jack before. The fighting in Sicily was brutal. The Germans and their Italian allies fought tenaciously to defend every inch of ground. The mountainous terrain favored the defenders, and the summer heat was oppressive. But the commandos pressed forward, capturing key positions and clearing the way for the main Allied advance. It was during the subsequent landings at Salerno in mainland Italy that Churchill achieved one of the most remarkable feats of his entire military career. The Salerno landings, which began on the 9th of September 1943, were contested fiercely by the Germans. The beachhead was precarious. German artillery pounded Allied positions. Counterattacks threatened to push the invaders back into the sea. Churchill and No. 2 Commando were ordered to capture a German observation post outside the town of Molina, which overlooked a critical pass leading down to the Salerno beachhead. The position was heavily defended. A conventional assault would likely have resulted in significant casualties, but Churchill had a different approach in mind. With only a single corporal, a man named Ruffle, for backup, Churchill infiltrated the German-held town of Piagaletti under cover of darkness. The two men moved silently through the streets, avoiding patrols, slipping from shadow to shadow. When they reached the first German sentry post, Churchill did not waste time with lengthy explanations. He simply appeared out of the darkness, sword in hand, and demanded their surrender. The Germans, confronted by this wild-eyed British officer wielding a medieval blade, chose discretion over valor. They surrendered. Churchill collected their weapons, instructed them to follow, and moved on to the next position, and the next, and the next. By the time the sun began to rise, Churchill and Corporal Ruffle had captured 42 German prisoners, including an entire mortar squad. Churchill marched his prisoners back down the pass toward British lines. The wounded were loaded onto carts, which the German prisoners themselves were made to push. Churchill later remarked that the scene reminded him of something from the Napoleonic Wars. It was, he felt, how warfare ought to be conducted, with boldness, with style, and with a certain respect for the enemy. For this extraordinary action, Churchill was recommended for the Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration in the British honor system. Ultimately, however, the recommendation was downgraded, and he received the Distinguished Service Order instead. Some who knew the details of what he had accomplished felt that the decision was unjust. Capturing 42 prisoners with only a sword and a corporal was the kind of feat that deserved the highest recognition. But Churchill never complained. He had done his duty. That was enough. There is a small footnote to the Piegaletti raid that captures Churchill's character perfectly. After delivering his prisoners to British lines, he realized that he had lost his sword somewhere in the town during the hand-to-hand fighting, so he turned around and walked back into enemy-held territory to retrieve it. Along the way, he encountered a group of American soldiers who had become disoriented and were inadvertently walking toward German positions. Churchill warned them. The NCO in charge refused to listen. Churchill shrugged, told them he was going his own way, and continued on to recover his beloved claymore. By 1944, Churchill was commanding commando operations in Yugoslavia, working with Josip Broz Tito's partisans against the German occupation. The Adriatic coast was a complex theater, with shifting allegiances, rugged terrain, and a brutal guerrilla war that showed no mercy to either side. Churchill established his base on the island of Vis, the largest Allied-held island in the Adriatic, and began planning raids against German positions. In May 1944, Churchill was ordered to lead an assault on the German-held island of Brač, the third-largest island in the Adriatic. He assembled a mixed force of about 1,500 men, including Yugoslav partisans, No. 43 Commando, and a troop from No. 40 Commando. The plan was ambitious, a night landing followed by a coordinated assault on German positions. The landing itself went smoothly, with the forces reaching the beach unopposed. But when the partisans saw the German gun emplacements overlooking their positions, they hesitated. They wanted to wait until the following day before launching the attack. Churchill disagreed, but he could not force his allies to move. The assault was postponed. That night, Churchill used his bagpipes to signal the commandos to prepare for battle the following morning. The sound of the pipes echoed across the dark water, a haunting reminder of the violence that was about to unfold. The next morning, the attack began. No. 43 Commando launched a flanking assault, while Churchill personally led the elements from No. 40 Commando toward the objective. The partisans, however, remained at the landing area, refusing to advance. The attack quickly began to fall apart. Churchill and only 6 other men managed to reach the objective. They were immediately hit by German mortar fire. The shells exploded among them, killing or wounding everyone except Churchill himself. He stood alone amid the carnage, and in that moment, facing certain capture or death, he did something that perfectly encapsulated his spirit. He raised his bagpipes to his lips and began to play "Will Ye No Come Back Again," a melancholy Scottish tune about longing and farewell. The Germans advanced cautiously, still uncertain what to make of this solitary officer playing music amid the battlefield chaos. When they were close enough, they threw grenades, One exploded near Churchill, knocking him unconscious. When he awoke, he was a prisoner. The Germans were not sure what to do with their unusual captive. His surname was Churchill. Could he be related to the British Prime Minister? German military intelligence decided not to take chances. They flew Jack Churchill to Berlin for interrogation. It was there that the truth came out. He was not related to Winston Churchill at all. They simply shared a common surname. But by then, the damage was done. Mad Jack Churchill was now a high-value prisoner in the heart of Nazi Germany. Churchill was eventually transferred to Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp located just north of Berlin. This was not a camp for ordinary prisoners of war. Sachsenhausen held political prisoners, resistance fighters, and other individuals the Nazi regime considered particularly dangerous. The conditions were harsh. The guards were brutal. Many who entered never left. But Jack Churchill was not the kind of man to accept captivity quietly. Almost immediately, he began planning his escape. He connected with other prisoners, including several Royal Air Force officers who had been captured after the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III. Together they hatched a plan to tunnel out of the camp. In September 1944, just a few months after his capture, Churchill and RAF officer Bertram James made their move. They crawled through an abandoned drain that led out of the camp, emerging into the surrounding forest. Their goal was to reach the Baltic coast, where they hoped to find a boat that could carry them to neutral Sweden. The two men traveled for days, moving through enemy territory, avoiding patrols, surviving on what little food they could scrounge. They came agonizingly close to success. But just a few miles from the coast, they were recaptured by German forces. Churchill was thrown into solitary confinement and eventually transferred to a different facility. In early 1945, as the war entered its final months, Churchill was moved again. This time, his destination was Niederdorf, a camp in the Tyrolean Alps of Austria. The camp held a collection of high-value prisoners, diplomats, military officers, resistance leaders, and other individuals the Nazis believed might be useful as bargaining chips if the war went badly, which, by that point, it clearly was. The prisoners at Niederdorf lived in fear. Rumors circulated that the SS guards had orders to execute them rather than allow them to fall into Allied hands. The tension was almost unbearable. Every day could be their last. Churchill, however, was not interested in waiting to see what the Germans would do. One night in April 1945, the camp's lighting system failed. Darkness descended over the compound, and Jack Churchill saw his opportunity. He slipped away from the camp, disappeared into the forest, and began making his way toward the Alps. For 8 days, Churchill traveled alone through some of the most rugged terrain in Europe. He climbed mountain passes. He forded icy streams. At one point, he injured his ankle badly, making every step an agony. But he kept going. He had escaped Nazi captivity twice before, only to be recaptured. This time, he was determined to make it. Finally, after walking nearly 150 miles, Churchill stumbled upon an American armored reconnaissance unit near the Brenner Pass. He was exhausted, injured, and half-starved. But he was free. The Americans could hardly believe his story. A British commando officer who had escaped from a Nazi concentration camp walked across the Alps on a broken ankle and survived to tell the tale? It sounded like something out of a movie. But then again, everything about Jack Churchill sounded like something out of a movie. By the time Churchill made it back to Allied lines, the war in Europe was winding down. Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945. The long nightmare was finally over. Millions celebrated in the streets of London, Paris, New York, and 100 other cities. But Jack Churchill was not celebrating. By all accounts, he was disappointed. According to his fellow soldiers, Churchill expressed frustration at the sudden end of hostilities. "If it was not for those damn Yanks," he reportedly said, "we could have kept the war going another 10 years. It was a joke, mostly." But it also captured something true about Churchill's character. He was a man who lived for adventure, for challenge, for the thrill of combat. Peace, however welcome it might be to most, felt somewhat anticlimactic to Mad Jack. But the war in Europe was not the only war being fought. In the Pacific, Japan continued to resist. Churchill immediately requested a transfer to the Far East. He wanted to continue fighting. He wanted more adventure. He was sent to Burma, where he trained to participate in the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Then came August 1945. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. And Jack Churchill found himself, once again, a warrior without a war. But Churchill was not the kind of man to settle into quiet retirement. In the years following World War II, he sought out new challenges, new adventures, new ways to test himself. He qualified as a military parachutist, adding another skill to his already impressive repertoire. He joined the Highland Light Infantry and was eventually transferred to British-controlled Palestine, where tensions between Jewish settlers and Arab populations were escalating toward open conflict. It was in Palestine that Churchill once again demonstrated his remarkable courage and humanity. In April 1948, a convoy of doctors, nurses, and patients traveling to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus was ambushed by Arab forces. The attack lasted for hours. Many were eliminated. Others were trapped in burning vehicles. British forces in the area failed to intervene effectively. Churchill, who was serving in the area at the time, took matters into his own hands. He coordinated rescue and evacuation efforts, personally leading the operation to save as many survivors as possible. It was estimated that he helped rescue approximately 500 Jewish doctors and patients. When asked later about the danger he had faced, Churchill shrugged it off with characteristic nonchalance. "People are less likely to shoot at you if you are smiling at them," he said. In the 1950s, Churchill finally retired from active military service. He had served his country for over 2 decades, fought in theaters from France to Yugoslavia to Palestine, and earned some of the highest decorations Britain could bestow: the Military Cross and Bar, the Distinguished Service Order and Bar, multiple mentions in dispatches. He was, by any measure, one of the most decorated soldiers of the Second World War. But retirement did not mean slowing down. Churchill threw himself into new hobbies with the same intensity he had once brought to combat. He developed a passion for coal-fired steamboats and spent countless hours sailing them on the River Thames between Richmond and Oxford. He built radio-controlled model warships, recreating the naval battles that had fascinated him since childhood. He participated in motorcycle speed trials, seeking the same adrenaline rush he had once found in combat. He also became an unlikely commuter legend. For years, Churchill rode the train from his home in Surrey to his office in London, and he developed a peculiar habit that startled his fellow passengers. As the train approached his station, Churchill would throw his briefcase out the window. The first time someone witnessed this, they were horrified. Was the man having some kind of breakdown? Had he lost his mind? The answer, as with so many things about Jack Churchill, was both simpler and more eccentric than anyone could have guessed. Churchill had discovered that his briefcase landed in his own garden, which bordered the railway line. By throwing it out the window, he saved himself the trouble of carrying it home from the station. It was, in its own way, a perfectly logical solution. It was also the kind of thing that only Mad Jack Churchill would ever think to do. In the years that followed, Churchill rarely spoke publicly about his wartime exploits. He was not a man who sought fame or recognition. When asked about his experiences, he was happy to share stories, especially over a nice glass of wine. But he never bragged. He never exaggerated. He simply told the truth about what he had done, and the truth was extraordinary enough. His son Malcolm later recalled that his father was remarkably humble about his achievements. "He did not brag about these things at all," Malcolm said, but he would be happy to talk to anyone who asked, particularly if it was over a couple of nice glasses of wine in the evening. That humility, perhaps more than anything else, was what separated Churchill from the mere braggart or showman. He had accomplished things that seemed impossible, but he never seemed to think they were particularly remarkable. He was just doing his duty, the way he understood duty to be done. Jack Churchill passed away on the 8th of March, 1996, at the age of 89. He died peacefully in Surrey, the same county where he had grown up so many decades before. The obituaries remembered him as one of the most colorful soldiers of the Second World War. The Royal Norwegian Explorers Club would later name him one of the finest explorers and adventurers of all time. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Jack Churchill came from the men who served alongside him. They remembered him not just as an eccentric officer with a sword and bagpipes, but as a leader who inspired them, who shared their dangers, who never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. They remembered his courage, his humor, his unfailing optimism in even the darkest moments. And they remembered the simple philosophy that guided his life. Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. The story of Mad Jack Churchill is, in many ways, a story about the limits of the possible. In an age of tanks and aircraft and machine guns, one man proved that individual courage and audacity still mattered. He showed that the old virtues of the warrior, the willingness to charge into danger, to face impossible odds, to inspire others through personal example, had not been made obsolete by modern technology. He was an anachronism, perhaps, but he was also a hero, and in the end, that is why we remember him. Not because he killed enemies with a longbow, though that was certainly remarkable. Not because he captured 42 prisoners with a sword, though that was an astonishing feat, but because he reminded us of something important about the human spirit, that there are still people in this world who refuse to accept limitations, who insist on living life on their own terms, who face danger with a smile and a song, and who prove again and again that the truly courageous can achieve things that the rest of us can only imagine. They laughed at his outdated sword. They mocked his medieval weapons. They thought he was mad. And then he became a legend. That was Jack Churchill. Mad Jack. Fighting Jack, the last of the longbow warriors, the man who went to war with a sword and a song and came back covered in glory. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who appreciates tales of extraordinary courage. Subscribe to the channel and join us next time as we uncover another forgotten hero from the pages of the past. Until then, remember, the truly brave are never outdated.